Thomas Jefferson is one of the architects of the Declaration of Independence. He had many principled aphorisms. One of my favorite is follow truth wherever it may lead. I used President Jefferson's quote as my guiding light while I was researching and writing Victory Day, Winning American Independence. Victory Day took about 17 years of research and about 2 years of writing, peer review and editing. Truth be known, there is no way I could have written this tome without the urging support and editing of my wonderful wife, Deborah, to whom this book is dedicated. Some of you in this room know my wife, Deborah, and can attest that she's a very great person. Books like Victory Day are now possible because we live in the age of digitized archives, ground-penetrating radar, and a revival of interest in how ethical principles spelled out in the Declaration of Independence turned a visceral colonial rebellion into a revolution for human rights the world could support. Victory Day follows the trail of now accessible facts from long cloistered archives to find that Charleston in particular, and South Carolina in general, was the epicenter of a world war that would decide the fate of government by the people in a world ruled by monarchs. When all seemed lost, sticking with our founding ethical principles won out over a British government policy of punishment and brutality that ultimately delivered our collective sovereign independence. So sticking with our founding ethical principles won the hearts and minds that won the war for territory possession, that won our independence for all 13 United States. To put it simply, Continental and Allied forces had to kick out all the King's forces and all the King's men with the consent of the people to win independence. Tonight I've been asked to share a few highlights of the book, the importance of the Cane Horn Peninsula to the British Southern strategy to conquer America, and how the natural environment and disease prevalent in the area at the time affected military control of the area on the map that you see over there during the 31-month British occupation of Charleston. So, with that introduction, we'll turn the slide. So, you got it here. Victory Day, in a nutshell, fills in the gaps of our untold revolutionary history. And it shows Charleston as the seat of the war. Now, that's a quote around the seat of the war. That quote came from King George III. He wanted Charleston to be the seat of the war, and he instructed his people, Lord North and Lord Germain, and Clinton, and General Clinton, that Charleston would be the seat of the war. It also talks about the evolution and defeat of the British Southern strategy. So what I was able to uncover is there were actually 4 different British Southern strategy plans. And so much of the material up to this point in time talks about the British Southern strategy as one big hodgepodge of something that you can't really make out, and that's because it was actually 4 plans over 7 years of war that all got bundled together. And I separated those and divided them into 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0 to put them in a vernacular language we can all understand. And then there's 3 numbers up here. When I conclude tonight, I hope you are going to know why those numbers are up there. I've already mentioned one, 31 months of British occupation of Charleston. So that was from about April of 1780 to December 14th, 1782. 31 months of really bad news, really bad news. 14, what's the 14? from the time of Yorktown to the time all of the king's forces and all the king's men left Charleston on December 14th, 1782. Add 2 more months to that, and it is the end of the war, because the British Parliament votes by a skinny margin of just 9 votes to grant us independence. So, those are the 3 numbers. So, Victory Day is Charleston as America's revolutionary story. So, where did I come up with this? I mean, yeah, you're talking about digitized archives, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in 1783, when General Greene retired to Congress after he met with George Washington, the U.S. Congress voted to take all of Greene's papers that were in several trunks and have them transcribed and bound and put into Congress and the Library of Congress. That did not happen. It was not completed until 2005. And it was completed by the University of North Carolina Press. Several of the authors, by the way, one has passed away, Mr. Showman, Dr. Showman was the first to start it before the bicentennial began in 1976. So it wasn't completed in 2005. This is just one volume of 13 volumes. Appropriately, there were 13 volumes. So this is command correspondence. So where Greene was, and Greene started the war, didn't start the war, but he started with Washington very early in the war. So it traces all of the command correspondence in all of his command centers, all the way through until he takes over the Southern Continental Command at the end of 1780. And so you have information now, over 8,000 pieces of correspondence, over 6,000 situational reports between him and Washington. Him and Washington, it turns out, when you read these, are very, very close. Probably, I would say, had the closest relationship of any 2 generals in the Revolutionary War. So you get to see this command correspondence, and you get to see the worry. You get to see the situational reports. What are we going to do now? In addition to that, when Greene comes to the southern area of operations and takes over command. Now he takes over command. We're talking about a command area all the way from Philadelphia, all the way down to the bottom of Georgia. That's a large area of operation. And here's the bad news. Half of it's more than half of it is under British occupation at the time. There's more bad news. There's not really much of a Continental Army for him to take over. They've been defeated at, many of you heard of Camden before. They were defeated at Camden and scattered. So he writes to Washington and he says, I've been given an army more of a shadow than one of substance. And Washington writes him back and says, I leave it to your own discretion to basically win this sucker. In addition to that, for some of the local people, and getting it down to a local connect, Greene had over 600 pieces of correspondence back and forth with Marion. Marion was one of his key spy masters. He was not only, many of us know him as a great, almost an inventor of the petite warfare. At that time, in warfare circles, it was referred to as a little war, meaning a command in the field and not have to be supported. They could live on the land, if you will, and strike at will to disrupt the enemy. The British were unfamiliar with this, even though they had encountered it during the French and Indian War and in some places in Europe, but this was very, very effective. So he was also the spy minister, and it goes through all of the correspondence on how they're setting up the spy network and how Marion's supposed to pay spies and that sort of thing, which is pretty difficult when you think about, we don't have a working continental currency at the time. So we're basically, he's basically having to steal gold from the British in order to pay the spies, which is kind of interesting. There's also over 200 correspondences between him and Thomas Sumter, Light Horse Harry Lee, presidents of Congress, spies, Adams, Jefferson, Lafayette, Rochambeau, Hamilton, British generals, state governors, state militia commanders, field commanders, French and American diplomats. Almost everyone that is leading the war, trying to figure out how to win the war, trying to survive it first, and then trying to figure out how to win it. On both sides, he's in regular command with the British. With your opposite, you constantly stay in command. You stay in communication also. So those letters exist as well. What else went into the book was over 200 additional sources, and I have a very extensive library, and my family is very generous to allow me to have all of these books stacked around the house. But I like my books very, very much. So this is the guy. In the book, we were able to get over 20 exhibits, and many of these exhibits, we have maps that don't appear any other place except in the papers of Nathaniel Green, and we were very gracious. The UNC Press, the Newberry College of Cartography, was very, very generous in allowing us to print all of these area of operations maps that were produced for the papers of Nathaniel Green, and they allowed us to put them in the books as well. The Mount Vernon's Women's Society, Ladies Association, was very gracious in when we found that this mesotint, I always want to call it a lithograph, it's actually a mesotint, was George Washington secured this after the American Revolution to put over his dining room table. So I just think about that for a moment. Would you, I mean, we all have very close friends. Do we put their picture over our That's how close the relationship is. We were able to get some exhibits like this from the Delaware Museum that shows the attack on at Fort Moultrie, at Fort Sullivan at the time, that was later changed to Fort Moultrie. You're able to see things like the flag, the Grand Union flag. Do people know what the Grand Union flag is right here? Let's see if I can get this thing to work here. Yeah. Huh. Doesn't want to. Reflects. But this flag right here, the red one, that's actually 13 stripes, and then it has the British Legion flag in the corner there. That was, they thought that this was, we were part of that. That's what that flag signifies. And then it also shows the Liberty flag there, with liberty inscribed in the crescent. So you're able to see in one snapshot, or excuse me, one painting, a reproduction of the painting, what's really happening. One of the other things that we were able to find out is this ship in the foreground here, which is stranded approximately where Fort Sumter is now, ran aground, it had secret weapon cannon on there called carronades. And this was, most historians up to this point in time thought that the earliest introduction of the carronades were in 1780. Well, this is 1776. What? Where did this come from? And because of digitized archives, you're actually able to go back to the cannon manufacturers and see they're making a deal to try and get the British government to buy these cannons, and they say, look, we know that you're going over there and you're going to pound Charleston. We'll give you some samples. Well, if those would have gotten into position, many of you remember Charles Lee saying, who took over command at Fort Sullivan, was the Continental Commander. He says, this is but a slaughtering stage. And he was referring to the top part of the fort where the cannons would fire on the ships. That's basically a stage area. And then you have your ports that you push the cannons up to and fire the cannons. Well, if the Acton was able to swing around just a little bit more, they would have been able to level those carronades and just sweep that whole area clean with just a few shots. That's how deadly this was. So this was a real breakthrough that was deployed when the British came back in 1780 throughout South Carolina, and it was very deadly. The British would put it on the boats that would patrol the Wando and Cooper rivers. And if there were people on the shore, they would bring their small craft close to the shore. And all they needed was this one gun, and they'd fire and they would clean out everything. So it was a very, very deadly weapon. How deadly was it? Well, in the Battle of Trafalgar, if you talk to most military historians, they will tell you that the difference in the British winning the Battle of Trafalgar was the carronade. So, we were also able to get one of these, a copy of the Declaration of Independence that was printed in the Charleston Gazette and Country Journal on August the 2nd to the 4th, thank you. The 2nd to the 14th in 1776. So it's really amazing. This was bid on and was purchased at the time for $1 million. It resides in the safe in the library. Maybe I shouldn't be revealing this. And the Post and Courier was very excited to participate, and they enabled us to have this in our book, and so they were very gracious about this. But this, for those of you who are Library Society members, can pay you dues, they might let you take a look at this. So it's very interesting. So this is the half of the area of operation. This is the lower south. And in the book, as I mentioned, when Greene came south in the end of 1780, the area of operations was from Philadelphia all the way down to Georgia. So this is just the lower south right here. So after Yorktown, what was left? Yorktown liberated Virginia. It stopped the rampage in Virginia. There's no doubt about that. And it was a very deadly rampage. But what was left after Yorktown? Wait a minute. The British still had control of Georgia. They still had control of South Carolina. And they controlled the east coast of North Carolina, all the way to where Fort Bragg is now. And so that territory had to be taken back in order for all 13 of the United States to be considered for independence, for sovereign independence. Now, Britain was talking at the time about, let's talk peace, and they were talking about, well, Sure, we'll have some independence. Well, this was the kind of independence that they had given Ireland recently. About 1780, Ireland was given a species of independence where they were still part of the crown, but they were able to have local committees to administrate things and have some government, some local government. So that was the species of independence that they were talking about. George Washington talks about this in his correspondence to Greene and that sort of thing. So the lower South, after Yorktown, if things were going to be left like they were, there probably would have been a two-country solution. As a matter of fact, that's what everyone was talking at the time. So many of you are familiar with the two-country solution offered as a solution in Korea at the end of the Korean War that split that country in half. You might say, well, wait a minute, that was way back then. Well, they split Poland a couple of years later. So in diplomatic circles, it was a frequent solution to split the country. And it was based on territory possession. So we stood to remain part of the crown after Yorktown if this territory was not contested. And here's our area. You can see here that St. Thomas, that's the parish name. We call it Cainhoy now, we call it the Cainhoy Peninsula, we call it Berkeley County and that sort of thing. Well, back in the day, during the American Revolution, there was a 12-parish system in this area. And one of the parishes was St. Thomas, the other one was Christ Church, which was where 17 is over to the seaside. And then you had St. John Berkeley, and you had St. Stephen, St. James, St. T. So this is real important, particularly when you're reading correspondence and you're trying to figure out what are they saying, what's going on, what's the situational report of the day, and that sort of thing. You need to be able to figure out where the troops are, what's going on, and what's happening. Well, by the way, this map does not include, you might see, well, where's Lake Moultrie and Lake Marion? It's not there because it did not exist. Right? South Carolina had no grand big lakes at the time, so they're man-made. And there were a lot of things that were different. Michael was telling me earlier that the Cooper River was 3 feet lower. Why is that? It's because the Santee now, in part of Lake Berrien, actually flows into the Cooper River and has raised it about 3 feet. Okay. Well, that's important when you're talking about gunboats moving around and a war of territory possession and that sort of thing. So why is this area so important? The answer is the 3 triangle strategy. And so if you look at basically where the Wando is and the Cooper, that's one triangle. The next triangle is from where the Cooper is over to the Ashley. The third triangle is from the Ashley to the Edisto. If you take those 3 areas, you take Charleston. You starve people out, so on and so forth. So the British knew that they had to not only take the harbor, but they had to control those 3 areas. There are similar areas. I'm originally from New York, and there are similar areas in New York, which is there's a lot of similarities with the geography of New York Harbor and Charleston, in the areas that have to be taken in, and you have to maintain possession of in order to maintain possession of the city. So St. Thomas Parish was absolutely key. It was also the key operating area for Francis Marion. Yes, the swamp fox, this was his territory. In fact, when he jumped out of the roof because he didn't want to drink with all of the officers in early 1780, before the British took it. He left Charleston to convalesce. He convalesced, most of the evidence points to a place called Wapata Meeting House. Not sure how many of you know where Wapata Meeting House is, but it's at the end of the Wando. And if you go to the Seaweed Restaurant what is it, 15, yeah, I get my mile roads mixed up. I think it's, excuse me, 15 Mile Road. That's where the meeting house was and Marion's rally point was. So when the militia was called out in these multiple parishes, that's where they would meet. That's where they would camp out. That's where they would pool all of their resources, their powder, their guns, so on and so forth. And that's where they would plan their operations, etc. So it was such a menace when the British took over Charleston. Guess who they sent up there? Cornwallis. They sent their best. And Clinton said to Cornwallis, "You go up there, and I want you to take 2 regiments." He took the 63rd, I think, and the New York Irish Volunteers. You're talking about 1,000 people were encamped up there to maintain control of the King's Highway, which went where 17 roughly followed where 17 is now. So they could protect that 17. They could keep Marion out of this area. And they could also come down and strike quickly. There was a fort out here called Fort Lampriere. Are any of you familiar with Fort Lampriere? It was right across from Daniel Island. If you know where the Wando dockyards are, right there, where Hopcaw Creek is. Well, it was right there. I think there's a country club there or something now. But there was a very sophisticated fort there. As a matter of fact, many of the best minds at the time thought it was impossible to take the fort. That's how well engineered it was. Unfortunately, a guy by the name of Milady decided, lost his nerve, and had all of his men pull out of that during the siege of Charleston. And they weren't very happy with him in Charleston. As a matter of fact, he had to get out of town. So, that fort there was a communication fort with Cane Hoy Tavern, which was, Cane Hoy Tavern was basically up here if you're looking at this map. And then you had Goddard's Island, which was here also. And there's correspondence that shows that Goddard probably had a cannon or 2 at it at one time or another. And it also shows that Cane Hoy, because if there was a bend right there where you could have the cannons come around and the ships coming up would turn broadside and could not focus in on their target before getting fired upon. So it was a perfect place to put cannon there. So this was fortified, the Wando River was fortified by the Continentals during the siege of Charleston. So the British had to go in and attack and take all of these areas out in order to capture Charleston. Well, why was this so important? One of the big reasons was during the siege of Charleston, almost 1,000 Continentals slipped into Charleston by going to Monk's Corner, getting on boats, and coming down the Cooper River right under the nose of the British, and then reinforcing Charleston. And of course, that made General Clinton pretty upset. And he said, "I want to control this river, and I want to control this river. I don't care what it takes. I want everyone up there." He sent his best up there. He sent Tarleton up here. He sent Coates up here. Wymus, I mean, these are bad guys. Balfour came up here. They wanted to clean it out. At that point, it became a war of mobility. And basically, catch me if you can. Strike fast,
run away, and hide in the swamps. I had a gentleman show me the other night a very interesting object. It was something that that they had dated back to the American Revolution, and it was a boards of cypress, heavy boards of cypress. During the irrigation of the rice, when two passages of one water needed to pass over another water, they would engineer planks going across one body of water so the water could pass over in one direction and the good water to feed the rice fields to go underneath. What's very interesting about this is that there are accounts that Francis Marion would disappear, and the small horses that he would ride would absolutely fit right underneath there. Now, did that happen or did that not happen? I can't say, and it's not in my book. But I found that very, very interesting. Wymus couldn't catch him. Tarleton could not catch him, and so hardly anybody could catch him. So this was the area of operations that was key to not only the British taking Charleston, but also was key for when the Continentals were starving out the British to get them to evacuate. This was their breadbasket. As many of you know, being members of this historical society, this was a land of plenty. There was semi-feral cattle, Spanish cattle that were here. That basically means they need very little tending and they'll take care of themselves. By the way, I understand it's, I've had this meat before. It really is excellent. And so they needed it for foodstuffs. They needed it for, they needed the plantations, which not only produced rice, but they also produced food. And the host nation support that the British needed, they needed 80% of host nation support in order to stay in Charleston. Well, General Greene was a former quartermaster. He knew what it took to feed troops. And plus, he was a great mathematician. He was always working numbers. All he had to do was get that below their 80%, and he knew he could slowly starve them out. And that's exactly what he did by restricting access to this area. You'll see in the last year of the war, after Yorktown, that this became so important to then General Leslie at the time, who was in command of Charleston, that he sent his best shock troops here to try and clean it out, and could not. Now, what's up here? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's air up here, but I mean, if we imagine this map going up here, this is where the Santee River is. This is one of the richest areas for producing vegetables and foodstuffs and that sort of thing in the entire lower South. Why? Because it flooded at the time. Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie were not there. So that was the key area. Leslie had killed 200 horses to solve three problems. One, he was having so many refugees come there, loyalist refugees, they didn't have any place to put them. So by killing the horses, they loosened up space. They also didn't have the feed. The feed thing, they were having to go out and hustle for feed every day for the 200 horses. In addition to that, they were short 4,000 rations every day. So guess what? You slaughter 200 horses, you solve all three problems. But by the same token, he's so upset about that he sends his best shock troops in here to take this whole area and to occupy a plantation on the Santee River so they can supplement their food supply for another 6 months. And in the meanwhile, Marion and Richardson and Horry are nipping at their heels all the time and attacking them, where they cannot sustain that post up here. And they eventually have to withdraw. And when they withdraw, and when Marion and the militia, Marion was actually assigned this area to close out the war. And in that, he was to restrict all British incursions into this area to get any foodstuffs or anything. And he did an excellent job up until the very last day and completed it. So, this gives you a map. This map is actually in the book also. It shows you the roads at the time also. Again, I talk about a war of mobility. So you're able to see by reading through and reading the events as they are happening, as the war is going on, you're able to see why they're moving in certain directions and why battle is occurring here. Now, if this doesn't tell you that South Carolina is pretty important to King George III, I don't know. These were all set up, or the lion's share of these were set up within 6 months of them capturing Charleston. This is an occupation. This is not what they call a silk glove invasion, like Mr. Putin likes to call Ukraine. This is not a friendly occupation. And this was the key. This was the key. When the Continentals took Charleston, they first took John's Island. They were able to take that and push the British out of there. Then they were able to take that second triangle I was talking about, between the Ashley and the Cooper. So that just left this last area that went all the way up to Monk's Corner. It was the key to the King's Highway. It was the key to the Great Wagon Road that went up. And that was the logistical key for taking over the 13 colonies by going south to north. And you were right at in the crossroads of everything. This was the only thing that was left. Once Cainhoy was cleaned out, many of you are familiar with the Hornwork and Citadel that was actually, there was only one road into Charleston at the time, in the King's Highway. And well, guarding the King's Highway was this medieval-like fortress. And we're talking 16-foot high walls where rows of cannons are placed. And you're also talking about a citadel where about half the entire town can go and seek refuge if there's an attack on the town, if there's a bombardment or something like that. We're talking drawbridge, boats. It's just, again, something that you might expect to see in Europe in the 17th century or something like that. But this is the last thing that's guarding Charleston. It's almost impregnable at this time without siege cannon. The military achievement that it took to liberate Charleston without a navy, without siege cannon, is probably unparalleled in military history. Particularly when you have something like this guarding the gates. In the end, there was so much disease that was running rampant inside the city. It was so crowded, and people were short on rations, anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 a day. General Leslie agreed to have a written ceasefire, and the merchants agreed to have a merchant agreement to continue commerce
trading with the British if the ceasefire was completed, and they did do that. That was consummated by General Anthony Wayne the day before. The day of the evacuation, Leslie agreed to have Wayne come, Wayne was one of his great cavalry commanders, to come to the redoubts up above this hornwork right here, and be actually shown through the gates and follow the last British regiments after their awaiting ships in the Charleston Harbor. You can see this place where this occurred. It's called Liberty Square in Charleston, and it's right outside the aquarium. It's right under our noses. But that is the, that's where the American Revolution successfully ended.